right, 2 Samuel 5. So we closed out, obviously, chapter 4 on Wednesday night. This chapter begins a new unit in 2 Samuel that will run to the end of chapter 10. So chapters 1 through 4 a section, chapters 5 through 10 are a section. And before we go any further, I want to make something known that is going to be important to bear in mind for the study of these chapters. The stuff that's located in chapters 5 through 10 is not presented in chronological order. This is often a we kind of read the Bible chronologically by default, and we have to remember that it was not always presented in chronological order. Now, when I say that it's not in chronological order, neither is it in the order that the chapters at the end of 1 Samuel were in, where we're kind of bouncing back and forth between two scenes that were happening simultaneously. Okay, we're focused on David, then we're focused on Saul, then we're focused on, and we might go back a day or two in time. That's not what's going on here. We are going to be reading about events in this chapter that happened both at the beginning of David's reign over all Israel, and then at least one that happened towards the end of his reign before his death. And so in chapters 5 through 10, the narrator, instead of presenting events chronologically, which is what he has done for the most part in Samuel so far, he is now going to be presenting material thematically or theologically, okay? And we're going to read that, or we're going to see that continue with chapter 11 through the end of the book. The events here are not chronological. They are thematically arranged or theologically arranged. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. But that's going to be a very important detail to remember for the study of these chapters. But Ishbosheth has been murdered, and that has cleared the way for David to become king over all of Israel. And this is something that has been 10 to 15 years in the making. It's been probably closer to 15 years since David was first anointed king by Samuel. But recall that that had been a private ceremony, just with his family. And then, of course, in chapter 2, he had been crowned king over Judah. But now we see that things are going to increase exponentially to where he is now realizing God's full promise for him. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Here we are, your own flesh and blood." The Hebrew actually says your flesh and bone. Even while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led us out to battle and brought us back. And so they're acknowledging that David was their military leader even when Saul was king. The Lord also said to you, "You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be ruler over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron. King David made a covenant with them at Hebron in the Lord's presence, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began his reign. He reigned 40 years. Now, a lot of times in the Bible, when you come across the number 40 years, it is a round number, okay? It doesn't mean the number between 39 and 41 particularly. 40 was a number that meant wholeness or fulfillment and the like. However, in David's case, it seems that 40 means 40 because he was 33 when he became, he was 30 when he became king over Judah. He's 37 when he becomes king over all Israel. He reigns for a total of 40 years if you count the years in Hebron over Judah. He dies at the age of 70. David's reign is usually dated to from 1010 BC to 970 BC. For those 40 years, David was king. 1010 BC to 970 BC. So again, we're talking about events that happened 3,000 years ago. Any comments or questions about any of this so far? All right, let's continue. So he's king over all Israel now. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites who inhabited the land. The Jebusites had said to David, "You will never get in here. Even the blind and lame can repel you," thinking David can't get in here. Yet David did capture the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. So, it is a little astonishing, at least to me. Again, I'm slow. I'm from Mississippi. But it's kind of astonishing to think about the fact that Jerusalem is such a huge part of the biblical story. It's mentioned over 800 times in the Bible, and yet only now, more than halfway through the Old Testament story, do we finally read about Jerusalem becoming an Israelite city. Does that not surprise anybody? Am I the only one who's surprised by that? Okay, I guess I'm the only one who's surprised by that. But we're only now seeing Jerusalem become an Israelite city. In Judges, Israel made temporary raids against the city, but they never conquered it. It was known as Jebus, really, but it was just kind of a name that represented the people that lived there, the Jebusites, all right? Elsewhere in the Bible, early on, it was known as Salem. Remember that Melchizedek, whom Abraham meets in Genesis 14, he was king in Salem, which Psalms identifies as Jerusalem. I was talking to somebody this week, I can't remember who it is. There is actually not a J sound in Hebrew. Any biblical name in the Old Testament that starts with a J, I can pretty much promise you does not start with a J in Hebrew, because there is no J sound in Hebrew. The reason that we have J sounds in a lot of our English names for Old Testament people and places it's basically Elfrieda's fault. It's the Germans that did it. No. In German scholarship, when they were bringing the words from Hebrew into German, they gave them the J at the beginning of the word. Jehovah is the ancient form of God's personal name, but in Hebrew, it's Yahweh. There is no J sound, but the J sound in English and German usually substitutes for the Y sound. Okay? So it's actually not Judah, it's Yehuda. And it's not Jerusalem, it's Yerushalayim. Okay? But that's something to bear in mind. Even early on during the period of Exodus, when Jerusalem is still just a Canaanite city-state reporting back to Egypt, it is known as, the word in Egyptian started with a U, Jerusalem. Okay, so Jerusalem is a name that's very ancient, but it was known as Jebus and some other things, just Salem. It went by several names, but here it becomes part of the nation of Israel. David is very shrewd for selecting Jerusalem as his new capital because Hebron was solidly in Judah territory. Jerusalem is on the border of Judah and Benjamin. It's a lot like early days in American history after the Revolutionary War. Our first capitals were obviously Philadelphia and New York City, but the southern colonies did not like that. They thought that was very prejudiced. So our founders decided to move the capital of this country a little bit farther south and put it in a neutral district that we now know the District of Columbia. Very good. So the same concept here, move the capital to a more geographically centered place and put it in kind of neutral territory, if you will. We're not entirely sure what is meant by this phrase, you'll never get in here, even the blind and lame can repel you. This is the Christian Standard Bible's translation of the Hebrew phrase, but it can be worded in different ways. Some think that it's kind of saying, hey, even our blind and lame people could keep you out, kind of the modern day version of, my mama could beat you up and she's in a wheelchair. Okay. Well, I mean, honestly, other people think that they are calling down a curse that if you try to attack this city, may you be struck with blindness or lameness. Okay. My personal opinion is that they're saying, our blind and lame are going to be able to keep you out. I think this translation is probably best on the mark, but we're really not sure how to render that phrase. I just point that out. David said that day, whoever attacks the Jebusites must go through the water shaft to reach the lame and the blind, who were despised by David. For this reason it is said, the blind and lame will never enter the house. And again, we're not entirely sure what that refers to either, but we'll pick that up in chapter 9. David took up residence in the stronghold, which he named the city of David. He built it up all the way around from the supporting terraces inward. David became more and more powerful, and the Lord God of armies was with him. Continuing in verse 11, King Hiram of Tyre sent envoys to David. He also sent cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. This verse 12, if you highlight one verse in the chapter, it needs to be this one. There's a very telling theological statement that the narrator is giving you right here. David knows why he's successful, and it's not because David's big, bad, and a great warrior. David knows that he's been successful because who has made him successful? God. And he knows that the purpose of that success is not for David's personal glory. It's for the blessing of God's chosen elect covenant people, Israel, right? Verse 13, after he arrived from Hebron, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of those born to him in Jerusalem. You have the names there. The one you'll probably recognize is Solomon. The first four are the sons of Bathsheba. And then the mothers of the other kids, we're not entirely sure. We're never really told who the mothers are for the rest of them, but obviously you'll recognize Solomon. He obviously will come later in the book, so we'll get to that in due time. Before we go on to the Philistine episode, I want to pass some things around. So this is, and I'm going to show the picture here in a moment, but this is the ESV Bible Atlas. This is one of the best books in my library. I love this thing to death. I've taken it out on several dinner dates, just me and this book. On this page is an illustration of what Jerusalem looked like in the time of David. And I want you to note how small it is. So I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but have certain people in your past kind of become time-locked a little bit? Maybe you first met them in their 40s and 50s, and obviously you've aged and they've aged, but they've just kind of always seemed as if they're in their 40s and 50s in your mind. Is that a common phenomenon? I got plenty of people, I've known them all my life. They're still kind of in their 40s when I first was aware of them, and now they're approaching 70, but I still think of them in their 40s. It's just kind of how it works. So Jerusalem kind of gets time-locked a little bit in your mind, and especially if you grew up in the church, most of the time you're encountering Jerusalem in terms of the first century, the New Testament. Am I right? Okay, reading the Gospels, okay? And so by this point, it's this massive city. Obviously, Jerusalem was not always a massive city. So I want you to note how small Jerusalem is in the time of David, and then I'm going to show you some comparison pictures in just a few moments. But I'm going to start this around, and then this is a volume from a set that I have on archaeological excavations in the Holy Land. Okay, this is volume 2, obviously covers Jerusalem, and it's got several black and white photographs if you want to take a look. What I specifically want you to note, though, is this photograph at the bottom of the first page. Get a kind of look at it now, and then I'll explain what you're looking at, and I'll pass the book around. This is a shot of the area of Jerusalem that was the city of David, the original city of David, and it's looking north, okay? I just want you to remember that. You're looking north, okay? So you're looking north, and this little area right here, was pretty much where everybody lived, and then this was kind of the Temple Mount area. This is very small. So I'm going to start this in the opposite direction. You can take a look at that. But this is kind of a look at what Jerusalem looked like back then. Even though it's a modern shot, you can kind of get an idea of the topography. Let's briefly look at the story of the Philistine attacks. So obviously, once they killed Saul and Israel kind of had a civil war going on between Ishbosheth and David, we don't read about the Philistines attacking. They're kind of content to sit back and watch Israel just destroy itself. But suddenly, when David becomes king again, they realize, okay, we know how bad David is. We know how powerful he is. We need to try and nip this in the bud. You know, they kind of had a Barney Fife approach to warfare here. Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel. They all went in search of David, but he heard about it and went down to the stronghold. So the Philistines came and spread out in the Rephaim Valley. This is a valley about a mile or two southwest of Jerusalem. Okay? David inquired of the Lord. I mean, he's got a good habit of that. Should I attack the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me? The Lord replied to David, attack, for I will certainly hand the Philistines over to you. I mean, just think about the confidence that you have when you go into battle. God saying, yeah, I'm going to give them into your hand, and it's going to be a bloodbath of biblical proportions. I mean, just how much confidence do you have when God said the battle is a foregone conclusion here? I think that's just tremendous. So David went to Baal Perazim and defeated them there and said, like a bursting flood, the Lord has burst out against my enemies before me. Therefore, he named that place the Lord bursts out. And that's what Baal Perazim means, the Lord bursts out. The Philistines abandoned their idols there. David and his men carried them off. Remember from 1 Samuel 4 and the Battle of Ebenezer and the capture of the ark. What did we say carrying off idols meant? They were considered to be what of war? Trophies. Yeah, they're trophies. And we read in a parallel account in Chronicles that David took them all and burned them, which is what he should have done under the law. Okay? So they capture the Philistine idols, they torch them. They're representing how their God, Yahweh of Israel, has completely demolished the gods of the Philistines. The Philistines came up against and spread out in the Rephaim Valley. So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, do not attack directly, but circle around behind them and come at them opposite the balsam trees. We really don't know what that translates to. That's one translation's best guess. Others call them willow trees. But when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, act decisively, for then the Lord will have gone out ahead of you to strike down the army of the Philistines. So in other words, God says, don't attack them head on, go around and attack them from the rear, cut off their means of retreat. And when you hear the sound of marching, and this is alluding to holy war, when you hear the sound of the army of God, the Lord of armies, as he's often referred to in Samuel, when you hear the sound of the Lord's army in the divine realm marching, when you hear that sound in the tops of the trees, rush into attack because God has given you the victory. This is all language representative of holy war. And we read here that David did exactly as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Geba to Gezer. This represented a distance of 20 miles, and of significance, if you're not really paying attention, in 1 Samuel 14, we read that Jonathan delivered a great victory because they pressed the battle all the way to Aijalon. This represents pressing the battle much further. So David essentially has pursued the Philistines and whooped them in the rear farther than anybody has ever done so since the Philistines first became a threat. In other words, the Philistines have been a thorn in Israel's side ever since they arrived in the Promised Land. The Philistines arrived in the Promised Land, and no one has really been able to subjugate them until David's time. David literally puts them in their place. And for the rest of David's reign, they really don't represent that much of a threat. Okay? And so this is really, really remarkable. Let's take a look at some pictures here just to give you an idea of some things. So this is a drawing of Jerusalem when David attacked it. This is what is referred to as the City of David. That isn't just a moniker. In ancient times, the capital city was always kind of thought of as the direct property of the king himself. It's not just that he lives there and it's his capital and that's where he reigns. He was considered to be the owner of the city. Okay, his name's on the deed of the property for all intents and purposes. So that's what's meant by this idea of the city of David. It's David's town. This is David's property. David has captured it. David owns it. To the victor belongs the spoils. You know, they say what? Possession is 9/10 of the law. Okay, this city belongs to David. And this is the Gihon Spring. This is the water source for Jerusalem. And we'll encounter the Gihon Spring a couple of times in the story of Jerusalem. But in the 1860s, I believe, there was an archaeologist named Warren, last name Warren, that discovered a water shaft down to the bottom of the Gihon Spring, and there was a tunnel. And basically the tunnel is right here, okay? And it leads from the bottom of the spring, and it's a tunnel inside to the city, basically so that the spring would run water into the city. Because technically the spring is outside the wall, okay? Why do you want water inside the wall?
It's yours.
Huh?
It would be considered yours.
Okay, but why else?
They can't cut it off.
Okay, yeah, when you're under siege, all right, they can cut off your water supply unless there's a tunnel, all right, that goes into the city, and you can get the water that way. And so David basically says, whoever goes up this tunnel, this aqueduct, this, whatever shaft, they're going to be able to conquer. And in the parallel passage in Chronicles, we read that Joab leads a contingent up this shaft, and that's how they get into the city. And they just, take their swords and go whackety whack whack, and everybody falls down, and they take control of the city. It's
So the
preschool
Jebusites
version.
built that tunnel?
I'm sorry?
The Jebusites built that tunnel?
So that tunnel actually dates back to 1700 BC. So yes, the Jebusites or whoever the inhabitants were in the 1700s BC, that's kind of in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, so that tunnel was already 700 years old-ish when this happened. But yeah, the original occupants would have built that. Yeah. But that kind of gives you again how that all worked. All right. Next picture. This is the picture that was in the book. Again, this is the size of Jerusalem in the time of David. Again, the spring is going to be right here. This is what's often called the citadel or the stronghold in the translation we read. That's where David ends up building his palace. There was this stepped stone structure that's referred to in the text. Archaeologists have already uncovered that. And then, of course, the rest of the city probably held about 1,000 people. This is the size of Jerusalem in the day of Solomon. So it's got a little bigger. We've got Solomon's palace and then this temple up here, okay? And you can tell it's kind of spreading out. This right here was the northern extreme of Jerusalem when David was reigning, okay? This is the size of Jerusalem in the days of Hezekiah. So we have fast forwarded about 300 years here, okay? Obviously, you've got this part that was in the time of Solomon, but this little area is new, and then this big whole area is new. And guess who lives in this big old area? Not just more citizens, but specifically in 722 BC, when the northern kingdom of Israel is captured by the Assyrians, and they're all sent into exile. This area of Jerusalem was flooded with refugees from the north. The population of Jerusalem more than doubled when these refugees came down in 722 BC after the northern kingdom was destroyed. This is in the days of Hezekiah, and then this is in the days of Jesus in the first century. So you can kind of see in these pictures the graduating size of Jerusalem through the years, right? Comments or questions about that? You can see that in the book too, but you got to flip pages. I thought it'd be better just to put them up here on the TV so you can kind of see the growth in size. Yes, sir.
Is that picture that he showed us, the photograph, that wall, is that the Wailing Wall?
No, the Wailing Wall is a part of the actual temple right here. It's the western wall of the temple, or where we think that one of the western walls of the temple. Yeah. That's not part of the city of David per se. Yeah. And remember, the temple, let me see if I can back up. Okay. So the temple is going to be built up right here. This is the threshing floor of Araunah, which David does not procure until the very last chapter of 2 Samuel. And this is where the temple will eventually be built by Solomon. This also is known as Mount Moriah. Does anyone remember what happened in Genesis on Mount Moriah?
Abraham was supposed to sacrifice his son.
This is where Abraham sacrificed Isaac, or tried to. Don't worry, my son. God will provide the sacrifice. There's a lot of tie-in between that story and the theology of the temple and sacrifice, etc. There's all kinds of cool little connections. But yeah, this is where the temple eventually was built. But this was the size of Jerusalem in the days of David, Hezekiah, and then, of course, the first century in Jesus' time. This is the bottom of the Gihon Spring. Okay, this is a perennial spring. So all year they've got access to water. And then this is part of Warren Shaft. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can take the tour and see Warren Shaft. I'm hoping to go to a tour of the Holy Land in the latter part of 2024. And so I'm hoping I can come back with my own pictures. That's going to be kind of cool if I can pull that off. But this is a picture of Warren Shaft there. So let's talk about some lessons from this chapter. Number one, from this chapter we learn it's important to get as many wives as possible, just like David did. Lesson number two, if you don't like that, it's important to assault the lame and the blind. And then finally, number three, cedar trees. From Hiram of Tyre, when you care enough to send the very best. So, I did this Wednesday night. I thought they were hilarious. Apparently they weren't as funny this time around. The other day I told a joke on Zoom and nobody laughed. It turns out I wasn't remotely funny. So I put these up here not only for comedic relief, but also to illustrate a principle that I'm very, very adamant about. You laugh at the absurdity of these. Okay, like Wednesday night, the lessons we looked at was don't murder anybody. Don't cut people's heads off. Okay. We laugh at the absurdity of this, and rightly so. But do you realize we do this with other characters in the Bible and other things all the time and we don't even realize it? In other words, we take what we perceive to be good people in the Bible, okay, we decide if someone's righteous or wicked, and then, if we're not careful, we decide that everything a righteous person does in the Bible is worthy of our copy and emulation. And we can imitate them and just do what they did. And I've had to jump up and down in the past and set my hair on fire to get people to realize, no. I actually have had people in Bible class argue with me that, well, Abraham lied about his relationship with his wife, so it's okay to lie sometimes. And I'm sitting there going, Abraham suffered because he told a lie. He got in trouble for telling a lie. Okay? We pretend that we can just do whatever righteous people did in the Bible, and that is not the case. Now, we don't go to these absurd extremes, and we don't go to absurd extremes like, well, I'm going to build an ark like God told Noah to build an ark. But if we're not careful, we do other things. We look, well, they did it in the Bible, so I can get away with it. No. There's even things that today really, really smart scholars argue back and forth as to whether or not this righteous person should have done this. I'll give you an example in the book of Acts. Paul, in his final visit to Jerusalem, has certain Christians who are Jews circumcised to appease the Judaizers. This is after he has written the book of Galatians. And there's a lot of debate in scholarly circles as to whether or not Paul was wrong to do that. I personally believe that he was. And so again, these absurd examples are a reminder. You just can't read the Bible and say, well, I'm going to do what they did. I've actually had people try to defend bigamy or polygamy to me because all of these righteous men in the Bible did it, so it's clearly okay. When I'm thinking, you are dumber than a bag of hammers. Every example of bigamy in the Bible ends up being a complete, unmitigated disaster for that family, without exception. Can we just sit with that for a moment? Every example of bigamy in the Bible ends up being an unmitigated disaster for that family because it is a betrayal of God's original plan for marriage that He set out from the beginning. Okay? So, these absurd ideas, I do not commend to you. They're merely the product of my mind at 4 a.m. when I haven't had my coffee yet. Number one, God's allowance is not His approval, and do not abuse His blessings. In one sense, God is allowing David to take multiple wives. He's allowing David to take multiple wives. Because in that time, for a king to have multiple wives, it was seen as proof of virility, strength, power, blessing, prosperity. Men, don't laugh. Wives, don't elbow your husbands. But it was kind of seen that if you had a lot of wives, you got a lot of money because you got to support all of them. And so this is an idea of which David is seen to be prospering and blessing. But we already know that this is not going to end well, don't we? We know this is not going to end well. And when God speaks to David through Nathan about the Bathsheba incident, He says, I gave you upteen number of wives. I gave you the concubines of your predecessor, Saul. I gave you plenty of women. Why in the world did you have to abuse your power to get one more? Why were you not satisfied with what I gave you? And it's a reminder to be careful about God's blessings and not abuse them. God's given something to you. God's blessed you with something. Sometimes we run into temptations where we want to misuse or abuse that blessing. Am I right? Am I right? You think about the first temptation of Jesus, turn these stones into bread. When I was a little kid, I never really understood what that temptation was all about. I mean, other than having, dinner with the devil, what's the big deal here? Well, food obviously is a blessing from God, and the temptation for Jesus was to meet a legitimate need in an illegitimate way. Are we sometimes tempted to meet legitimate needs in illegitimate ways in life, to abuse God's blessings? And especially here, I want to just mention this real quick. This is something that I've begun to think more and more about, and I think it's a really good way of looking at the Bible when it comes to some thorny issues. God's allowance is not his approval. God allows or permits some things in the Old Testament, but just because he permits them does not mean he approves of them. Let me give you an example. There's a lot of debate, obviously, in our day and time. Why in the world would a God of love allow slavery to occur in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, the first century? Why does Christianity not just completely abolish slavery, rule out slavery? Why does it give rules for masters and servants, etc.? Why in the law of Moses were there regulations for slavery, etc.? So one thing you need to remember is that our conception of slavery, which is essentially slavery in the antebellum South for all intents and purposes, and then the slavery of biblical times were not exactly the same thing. It's not an apples to apples comparison. That said, the other thing that you have to remember, just because God allowed slavery did not mean that he approved of it. And when you really get down into the nitty-gritty of the conversation, you start to recognize that even in the New Testament, if Christianity had wanted to completely, outlaw slavery across the board immediately, Christianity would have been killed in the crib because it was such an enmeshed institution. But you go back and look at the abolition movement, not only in this country, but in the rest of the world. Guess who it's been historically that have been on the front lines of the abolition movement? Christians. Because people recognize that the seeds of abolitionism were sown in the New Testament. And so when we look at things like this in the Bible and we think, well, God allowed this, how in the world could he allow such a horrible thing? We have to remember God's ways are above our ways, and we have to respect the fact that his allowance was not always his approval. There's a difference there. Does that make sense to everybody? Any comments or questions on that? And I think that certainly applies to David and his family. Number 2, God always keeps his promises. We've been through a lot of chapters since 1 Samuel 16, when David was first promised that he would become king over all Israel. It's been a long time, but God has been faithful and God has kept his promise. And remember, I think it was verse 12, I believe, that I said if there was one verse in the chapter you needed to highlight, that it needed to be that one. Again, that is where I think the key truth of the entire chapter, and maybe the key truth of David's entire reign, but that's where the key truth of the chapter shines through. It's this: David knew that all this power and prosperity had been given to him because the Lord had given it to him. And it wasn't just for David's personal glory. It wasn't as if God said, oh, David, you're just a great guy, and I think the world of you, and man, I'm just going to make you prosperous and do all this wonderful stuff. Do any of you familiar with what's called the prosperity gospel? Raise your hand. You ever heard the term prosperity gospel? Okay. How many of you have ever heard of Joel Osteen? Okay. Joel Osteen is a proponent of prosperity gospel. Sometimes it's called the health and wealth gospel. It's the idea that if you are serving God, he is going to make you healthy and wealthy and happy. And if you're not thriving in life, then you have clearly done something wrong. Okay? Some terms for this are false doctrine, heresy, lies, deceit, baloney. There's a Greek word called skubalon that comes to mind. That's what I think of it. Paul uses the phrase in Philippians chapter 3 around verse 11. Skubalon, I say. When we think about this idea of God bless me, bless me, bless me, help me, help me, help me, protect me, protect me, protect me, let's all face it, we've all prayed prayers that resembled more like a letter to Sears Roebuck or Santa Claus than it did actually a prayer to God. Can we all cop to that? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Oftentimes our thought is, God bless me for whose sake? God, I want you to give this to me, help me out in this way, heal me, whatever, for my sake. It's for my benefit. And David recognizes he's been made powerful and prosperous, but it's not just for David's own personal glory. It's not for David's sake. And as much as the phrase occurs in Scripture for the Lord's sake or for His name's sake, as Hezekiah talked about in the prayer we looked at last week in the sermon, that's not even what verse 12 says. That God did it for the sake of His people Israel. God knew that they needed David. Let me repeat that. God knew that they needed David. Now, in the early part of 1 Samuel in our lessons, we talked about this idea that, Israel wants a king. God is supposed to be their king. They're being stubborn and rebellious by not allowing God to be their king. But even in the previous chapters, Judges, we see that Israel, if they're not going to be faithful to the law, they need a physical king over them. And God knew that Israel needed David. David was not raised to power and strength and prominence and prosperity for his sake. And it wasn't just for God's sake. It was for the sake of His people. And it's a reminder to us that when we know that God has blessed us and helped us and given us power and prosperity, we have to remember it's not just for our sake and it's not just for God's sake. It's for the sake of His covenant community, which is no longer limited to just Israel, but the church. Then finally, number 3. Like David, we too are seeking Zion. To my knowledge, this is the first time in the Bible that we read or encounter the word Zion, which we believe referenced or referred to the original citadel, that very prominent part of the Jebusite city that David made his citadel, his stronghold. That is what referred to Zion. And yet the word throughout the rest of the Bible becomes a second label for Jerusalem. It becomes a synonymous term with the Temple Mount itself, but it also becomes one with the name of the city that you and I are seeking as Christians. In one of the many more ties between Samuel and Hebrews chapter 11, verse 10, the Hebrew writer says that Abraham was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Verse 16, but they now desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. And then when we come to chapter 12, verse 22, our author says, you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. I want you to think through the songs in our songbook that mention Zion. What are they referring to? Heaven. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Zion's call sweetly rings over land and sea, bidding us look to realms above. This idea, this Zion theology, becomes so prominent for the rest of Scripture. So much so that the Jews eventually began to abuse it. Remember what we talked about abusing God's blessings? In the days of Jeremiah, they could not conceive that God would actually allow Jerusalem to be destroyed, which is what all the preachers were telling them, because this is God's special city and this is where His presence is. But you remember, Ezekiel received that vision of the Lord's glory departing the temple and then the city to demonstrate that, yes, God would reduce this city to the ground. And it's because they failed to recognize that there's always another layer and another layer and another layer to what God is talking about. You see, you and I are seeking Zion, not the physical reestablishment of that city in the Middle East, which is what a lot of our religious friends believe when it comes to premillennialism, and the temple's going to have to be literally rebuilt before Jesus can come back and all this. That's nonsense. The Zion that we now look forward to is in the spiritual heavenly realm. Just because we can't see it doesn't make it any less real. But we are looking forward to the heavenly Jerusalem that the New Testament talks about. For now, at the end of this chapter, as we think about David established in Jerusalem, and as we go forward into the next chapter that we'll look at next Sunday, chapter 6, we're going to see David increasingly wanting to grow the prestige of Zion, not for his sake, but for the glory of God. Because David knows that this is a special place that God has chosen to dwell with his people. And as we learn more and more about the special habitation of Zion or Jerusalem in the Old Testament, it reminds us of just how special and unique that heavenly abode is going to be for all of us when we get there one day. Let's close in prayer. Father, we're thankful for all the lessons you've shown us through David's life. We're thankful for your faithfulness to him. And Father, as we long to enter the gates of Zion ourselves, I pray, Father, that you will sustain us and give us strong endurance that we might persevere to the end. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you so much.